Into the last session here with Rick Oliver. Rick, take it away. It's all yours.
Thank you. Here we go. Hang on. We're about a quarter of the way through. I actually teach a 14-week course at the Bible College, and I still can't cover everything. So to try to do it in a few, hour-long sessions is pretty difficult. I can tell already I'm not going to get to the astronomy section tonight, so that's probably what I'll hit on tomorrow. There's some amazing things going on in the scientific community by creationists, by Christians. And that was one of the things that when I first became a Christian back in 1987, which was 7 years after Mount Saint Helens blew up, it took that long of in-my-face research before I finally realized there was a God and I wasn't him. And that's a big step for a scientist, let me tell you. But I had relied on the geology, and like I said, I could intimidate my students into silence. I just baffle them with terminology. But if they really got me, I would just say, well, we haven't proven that yet in biology, but we will. But the geologists, they've proven it, or we'd find analogy. And if all else fails, I would always go hide in quantum physics because no one could ever go there because that's weirder than science fiction. But there's some really neat stuff going on. I actually was blessed. My education after I became a Christian was phenomenal. I could never in my wildest dreams have ever planned out the education I got. Pastor Chuck Smith, who was my pastor who sent me down to Institute of Creation Research in San Diego, and I met Dr. Henry Morris and Dr. Richard Bliss and Dr. Steve Austin, who you're going to see here in a few minutes. All these wonderful men of God, but great scientists, which I didn't really know they existed because I'd always say, oh, well, those Christians, they're not really scientists. They have a degree from some seminary somewhere, whatever. Well, then not only that, then Pastor Chuck introduced me to one of my mentors, and he and his wife, Bjartra, A.E. Wildersmith, and his wife Bjartra took Susan and I in. They're like we were their long-lost kids. Wildersmith was probably one of the most brilliant, sweet, gentle men I've ever met, but he had 300 PhDs. I thought, I couldn't even fathom that. And we have a lot of really good scientists out here. And this is a brand new series. It's not even on the market yet, or it might be, I think July 1st it's come. The producer, Kyle Justice, is an Emmy award-winning videographer, producer. He was able to get together some of the world's leading scientists on astronomy, astrophysics. He got Dr. Donald DeYoung, Dr. Russ Humphreys, Dr. Danny Faulkner, Dr. Jason Lyle, and then he got Spike Visaras from the military and from NASA, the space program. They have produced these in 3 sets. They're each 45 minutes long. There's 3 DVDs to a set, and there are 13 sets coming out. But right now, these are the only ones available. He sent these to me when he found out I was coming up here to go out on the road again. So I got them before anybody else even got them on their hands. And we sat down and watched them, and they were absolutely breathtaking. Amazing videography. Dr. Russ Humphreys, his IQ's out in the stratosphere somewhere. These guys, and they're astronomers and astrophysicists. And see, that's really important. Just like I have a DVD in there on global warming. And 9 of the world's leading scientists from Denmark, Japan, Israel, Canada, the UK, America, the co-founder of Greenpeace, the lead author on IPCC, are all there. And they're all climatologists. And see, that's important. People don't catch that. When Al Gore's movie came out talking about, inconvenient truth, I had my whole staff at the school where I was a superintendent watch it because they were really into, we need to be good stewards. As Christians, God said declared this creation of his very good. So it's up to us to take care of it, to be good stewards, but not to worship the creation instead of the creator. And so we went to see I made them watch the movie. I said, now count the number of scientists in the movie. There wasn't one. He mentioned a friend of his who was a scientist. And then he talked about the 2,500 of the world's leading scientists signed this declaration about global warming, which is now climate change. Well, when they actually went through that 2,500 names, not one single climatologist signed it. Not one. They had PhDs in accounting and, all kinds of stuff, but no climatologists. So that'd be like, if you have a brain tumor, you don't go to a podiatrist, so why would you? And so that's why it's important that these guys, they're all top in their field. And the same with the global warming thing. So anyway, I won't get to that until probably tomorrow. But another question I ask, and I ask that room full of scientists, and I ask Christians, everywhere I go, besides, how we date fossils, I ask them, how many of you have heard of Dr. Werner Gitt? Anybody in here that's never, well, I know you have, because Dr. Werner Gitt is a professor at the Federal Institute of Physics in Germany. An absolutely brilliant man. He wrote a book called In the Beginning Was Information. Again, it absolutely devastated the secular. And so I did a whole lecture on just his book on information. What is information? I'll probably get there tonight maybe. But again, every Christian in the world should know who Dr. Werner Gitt is. Same thing with Dr. John Sanford. Dr. John Sanford is a geneticist from Cornell University. He and 5 other scientists, and 2 of them have multiple PhDs, all geneticists, through the Freedom of Information Act and so forth, they got their hands on the actual genome project. Dr. Francis Collins and his team got the Nobel Prize, they're at the White House. And it was so exciting when they were talking about mapping the entire human genome, and they were talking about being able to cure Alzheimer's and autism and old age. They're going to cure everything and just give us the money, Well, then you had 2 teams competing. You had Dr. Collins' team, and then you had a private consortium they were racing to be the first because they wanted to patent some of these things. Well, Dr. Francis Collins' team won, and really blew the other team out of the water, and the other team was a little bit taken back by how they could do it so fast. Well, when they finally went through the research, they found out that Collins' team had arbitrarily discarded 10,000 sequences of the genome. And by the way, a genome is your entire genes. All of your genes that are all put together that make you who you are is your genome. Well, they discarded 10,000 of the sequences, and when they were questioned about it, they said, well, that was just junk DNA. Have you ever heard that, junk DNA? Well, we now know there is no such thing as junk DNA. In fact, it turned out to be way more complex than they even imagined. They knew it was complex. They also knew something else, that it was decaying, entropy, the second law of thermodynamics. But they had no idea at the rate. Well, they went through Collins' research line by line, page by page for 3.5 years. It took these scientists. What they came up with was astounding. Well, the first edition of this book was mind-boggling. But again, they couldn't beat them on their credentials. They couldn't beat them on the science, so they nitpicked it to death. So this one, brand new. They just came out this year from Dr. Sanford. He actually heard I was lecturing on his first book, and I got a phone call at Tonto Basin, Arizona, which is talk about out in the boonies. We don't even have a traffic signal in our whole town. We have a post office, a mom and pop store, and a gas station. It's 45 miles to Walmart, but I get a phone call in Tonto Basin, and the guy says, "This is Dr. Rick Oliver." I said, "Yeah." And he said, "I'm Dr. John Sanford." Well, it didn't even dawn on me. And he said, "I hear you're lecturing on my book." And then John Sanford from Cornell University? Yes, him. He actually flew from New York to Phoenix, rented a car, and drove out and stayed with my wife and I in Tonto Basin for a week. And it was amazing what he showed me. And then he actually hooked me up to the Cornell University computer so that we could check some of these statements that were made. The computer modeling. Everybody should know who he is. But they found some things. First of all, the complexity of the genome, it actually, some of the genes are multifaceted. They code for more than one thing, which makes it even more astounding. But the decay rate was terrifying. They determined that there are over 100 deleterious mutations per person, per generation. And so that would mean that I have 100 more detrimental mutations than my dad had. My son has 100 more than me, and so forth. Well, then they modeled that. They put it into the computer and modeled it backwards. So how far could you go back with the human race, and come forward till we would be extinct because the genome would completely disintegrate? That's why you haven't heard about the book, because you can only go back about 8,000 years, or this whole human race would be extinct because of the decay rate. And they tried different parameters, different numbers, and so forth. But anyway, it's in this. He did a very good job of making it understandable, but it's still a science book. So if you've got science-oriented people, this book is beyond good. So anyway, just so you see how exciting it is right now and for creationists. Well, Mount Saint Helens was kind of a turning point for me. There were a couple of obstacles that I had. After I became a Christian, astronomy was the biggest one, trying to come to grips with Genesis and the distance between the stars, and the billions of light years and so forth. I stumbled with that until God and the science brought it to the forefront and solved that problem. But Mount Saint Helens was one of the bigger stumbling blocks I had prior because of the geology. I'd have people say, "Well, how can you ignorant Christians believe the earth is only, 8,000 years old? Just look at it. It looks old." Well, that can be deceiving. I had a friend of mine that came back from Vietnam. He was 19 years old. He was a prisoner of war. I found out that he had gotten back and he was in the hospital, and I went to visit him. I found out what floor he's on, so I'm walking down the hall to his room, and I passed a few people, and I got to his room, and nobody was in there. And so I asked the nurse where he is. She said, "You just walked right by him." I walked back down the hall, and I couldn't believe what I was looking at. 19 years old, had pure white hair. He looked like he was 80. Why? It's called stress. So what do you think would happen to this planet if we had a worldwide flood? Can you imagine the tectonic upheaval, the stress on this planet? So what I see is not obvious age. I see a planet that's recovering from massive stress. But the other thing is we could argue all night long on how the Grand Canyon got there. Isn't it interesting, though, that no scientist, well, there probably are. I don't know of any scientists that still believe that the Colorado River carved the Grand Canyon. Most of the scientists today believe in something called the Missoula flood. It was a flood after the Little Ice Age, and it blocked up the water, and it breached the dam, and it come down through and carved the scablands in the Grand Canyon. But isn't it interesting? I've asked people, and I never got a satisfactory answer, is if the Earth is billions of years old, why are there not a whole bunch more Grand Canyons? And when you look at the layers at the Grand Canyon, you don't see any big cuts or grooves or anything. Why just that one canyon? Well, suppose that there was just one flood, and it was a big one, But we could argue about that. But we can't argue about the canyon I'm going to show you here in a minute. It's called the Little Grand Canyon. It's 150 feet deep, a quarter mile across, and 15 miles long through solid bedrock in just a matter of hours and days. 600 feet of minute strata laid down in this 300-mile-an-hour blast. We saw biologic recovery happening mind-boggling speed. We saw coalification, fossilization, all these things happening in a time frame that didn't fit with my uniformitarian time frame. But this was in 1980, May 18th, 1980. 17 seconds past 8:32 in the morning. I'll never forget that. 57 people died that morning. Most of them shouldn't have even been in the area. David Johnson, a young geologist, was on a ridge in an observatory that had been set up by the National Geological Survey, and the National Geological Survey headquarters was in Vancouver. The ridge was 5 miles away and 1,400 feet high. In fact, now, if you go up there, it's Johnson Observatory. They named it after him. But again, I think God had a plan, because if that volcano had blown up on Saturday night instead of Sunday morning, there would have been thousands of people killed, because the governor had relinquished to the pressure and allowed people to come in and through the red zone, and the Forest Service and the Rangers and the sheriffs got them all out Saturday night. But if it had waited till Monday morning, there would have been thousands killed. Weyerhaeuser had scheduled 3,000 loggers to come in and do a logging operation. So again, I think God didn't want any to perish, but the ones who did, most of them, like I said, should not have been there. David Johnson, in theory, shouldn't have been killed, because where he was, had the volcano done what we thought it would, blow up, he probably would have been fine. But you see, we didn't understand things. Mount Saint Helens has been such a laboratory. It's given us so much to work with for volcanoes and things now. Volcanoes don't sneak up on you, like an earthquake. They give you plenty of warning. And Mount Saint Helens did. So scientists from around the world congregated there in the area. It was considered one of the most beautiful places on earth. This perfect cinder cone volcano, old growth forest, Spirit Lake down here in the forefront. But that's another deception. It looks peaceful and beautiful. Stratovolcanoes are the really dangerous ones. Most of the volcanoes in the Pacific Rim of Fire, like Mount Hood, Mount Rainier, Mount Adams, Mount Shasta, Lassen in California, all these, those are stratovolcanoes. They're extremely explosive and dangerous. Where the Hawaiian volcanoes, they're called shield volcanoes, and they produce, these massive rivers of very fluid lava. But the nice thing about Mount St. Helens is it didn't produce this lava to cover everything up, to bury everything. It just was a complete laboratory that was designated a national monument immediately. So you couldn't even take a piece of ash from that site unless you were a scientist. And I got the lava dome, and I have some of the actual ash. And by the way, all of the ash now has compacted into a sedimentary rock. Well, on the morning of May 18th, there was a 5.1 earthquake right at the base of the north face. What we hadn't realized was the mountain had weakened tremendously based on the fact that it was bulging. We knew the bulge because we had all kinds of equipment and lasers and everything set up, people flying around, everything. The mountain was bulging at a few centimeters per day. The last week prior to the eruption, it was bulging at over 50 feet per day. I mean, it looked like a pregnant mountain. What was happening is magma was forcing its way up through a lava tube, and it had weakened the mountain. So when that 5.1 earthquake occurred, the entire north face slid. It was the largest landslide in recorded history. Over a half a cubic mile of debris, not square mile, cubic mile. Your brain can't get around that much material. So a half a cubic mile of debris slides down and straight out across that 5-mile valley and up over that 1,400-foot ridge that was 5 miles away. That's a mass. It was traveling at an estimated 150 miles an hour. But as soon as the landslide left, it created this kind of horseshoe shape. The blast then was directed straight north, and the blast was traveling at over 300 miles an hour. It outraced the landslide debris and incinerated everything. It leveled 150 square miles of forest in 6 minutes. That's enough trees to build 650,000 three-bedroom homes. That's a lot, all in, boom. And it laid down this layers that no one could, if we hadn't seen it, we would have said, no, that's not possible. David Johnson was on the ridge because he was a nice guy. He really wasn't supposed to be there. Harry Glicken was the scientist who was actually out there. He'd been out there, and at this time there were no roads. It was cold and wet and very remote. It was a national forest. And so they set up this observation point, and Harry had been out there, no hot food, no shower, anything for a week. He was the observer. Well, a group of scientists flying down to go to Vancouver, to the headquarters, stopped. They flew down in the helicopter and they stopped on the ridge just to see what they needed to bring back the next morning. This was Saturday night. They were going to come on Sunday. Well, David saw Harry looking pretty bedraggled, and he said, hey, Harry, why don't you fly on into Vancouver, get a hot meal, a shower, get cleaned up, and then come back tomorrow with the team? He said yes, and he jumps in the helicopter and flies off. Little did we know what was coming. Here's what it looked like a week later. Looked like the moonscape. It was absolutely devastated. But one of the things that happened is when that landslide left, half of it slid into Spirit Lake, half of it, so that's a quarter of a cubic mile of debris slid into the lake, another quarter slid into the Toutle River Basin, completely buried the river, dammed it up. And that's where we got some of these lahars and mudflows that carved this canyon that I'm going to show you. The other thing is, when that quarter of a cubic mile of landslide debris hit that lake, it created a wave over 800 feet high. And the way they figured that out is they measured the crest where it slammed into the bank across the lake. And when all that water hit up there, and then it goes rushing back into the lake bed, it drug with it over 1 million trees that had been blown over. That was important. And that's one of the things that I do in the actual Mount Saint Helens DVD that I have out there. I show you the log mat and the bark. See, the logs were washing back and forth and the bark rubbing together, and it fell to the bottom, being covered by tons of sediment, which was perfect formation for coal beds. Dr. Steve Austin had written his doctoral dissertation about 6 months earlier, before Mount Saint Helens erupted, and his hypothesis, his theory was that the coal beds over Pennsylvania, Kentucky, wherever, Virginia, was created during the worldwide flood, when all these trees would be floating on the surface of the floodwaters and the bark would fall to the bottom. Because when you actually look at coal, you shave it and you look at it under a microscope, it's perfect sheets of tree bark. So he had hypothesized that during the flood and all the sediments after, that's why we have those tremendous coal beds. So here we have Mount Saint Helens, the same thing happening on a smaller degree. And what we found was amazing. Trees falling out, fossilization, all this. But that's, again, if you're really interested, there's a complete DVD on just that out there. Mount Saint Helens lost almost 4,000 feet of elevation in that initial slide. And like I said, it was an amazing event seen by the world. Here's the beginning of that little Grand Canyon that was formed by the mud flows and the lahars over the next few hours and weeks and days and so forth. Here is this red thing, that's the visitor center. That's where David Johnson was on the morning. That's now where the observation, the museum is. Over there's the mountain, over there's Spirit Lake. Here are some of those, the layering effect. You can see the lab assistant down here. This area right here is some of the old landslide material, some of the new mixed. Here we have the ash fall. This area here is the pyroclastic flow. And then this last area up here was one of the mud flows. Now, when you look at this and you get up close and you see the minute layering that happened in this 300 mile an hour blast, if I hadn't seen that happen, if the world hadn't seen that happen, we would say it took millions of years for this erosion and each layer laid down and so forth. But it happened immediately. So here we have an alternative. Like I said earlier, we just want to teach it all. Let's stop messing around and, well, we can't teach creation because of the metaphysics. That's not science. No, we're talking about two faith-based religions. Either man's word, evolution, uniformitarianism, or God's word, creationism. But I had great faith in my religion, which was science. Now I have great faith in God's word. But the preponderance of the evidence falls in favor of God every time. And the math certainly does. And, as I showed you in the first session, well, you're going to hear the last words of David Johnson. You're going to see what he saw coming at him. And then we'll continue there.
Vancouver! Vancouver! This is it!
Pretty frightening, terrifying. We think he was running, trying to get down behind. We don't know. We never found any sign of him or any of the equipment or anything else. There was another scientist by the name of Keith Reinholm who was on an area over, it's called Bear Meadow. It was 15 miles away. And he had set up a huge, one of those giant lens, 35 millimeter. And he took all of these sequential hundreds and hundreds of pictures. That's how you get that motion. It was digitized. Nobody was there with a video recorder that survived. Here, again, is inside the dome. You can see that lava dome that was building up. It built up, it blew a couple out, then it started to act like a giant cork. It's over 1,000 feet high and 2,000 feet around. This is a piece of that lava dome. And again, we'll show you how important that was. I should have been suspicious, though. When I was invited to go back in there in 1992 by a great geologist, world authority, Dr. Steve Austin, he had heard about my story and he invited me to go on this expedition. I should have been suspicious when this great geologist invites me, a lowly biologist, to go on this trip. I found out later he couldn't get permission to take a mule, so he took a biologist. 60 pounds of rock later, I found out why. I carried his lunch even. He kept stuck. But when we went in there, we had to climb in. We weren't allowed to fly in or any equipment. It was really tough, too. It was really rough. We had determined our route a week earlier. And this will show you how the geologic catastrophism created these events like overnight. It was still very steep, very high, very hard, and we had to walk it. It took hours. Here we stopped. See that waterfall back there? You can see I have the heavy pack. I even carried his lunch. He carried this pointy little hammer, and that was it. We stopped there, not because it was such a beautiful place, but because that canyon there and that waterfall wasn't there a week earlier. That's how quickly the geology could change there at Mount St. Helens. In fact, so we're sitting there trying to figure out how we were going to go in. We had to retrack, and it was, like I said, it was pretty tough. I was the gullible one. He was the smart one. So we get into the crater, and it's still very eerie. You can see steam coming out of the top. That's snow and ice, but it was very eerie. You'd hear these landslides, rocks falling, and it'd spook you. But we went in there to take samples of the lava dome. Because remember I told you in the first session that carbon dating cannot date fossils, it can't date rock. And it can't give you million-year dates. We can only date igneous rock using the radioisotope methods like the uranium, the potassium, the argon, these things. Well, here we have a known age rock. We watched it form. We watched it ooze up in there and slowly cool. Took 12 years, and it crystallized into this igneous rock called dacite. Different types of igneous rock, andesite, dacite, granite, these types of things. But we know how old it is. So we took the samples, and by the way, it was very expensive. It's very expensive to date. In fact, Seth asked me, you showed you the first one, the soft tissue in the dinosaurs. Somebody asked, did they carbon date the blood cells or the skin in those dinosaurs? No. When she was asked, she said, no, it's too expensive, and we already know it's 65 million years old. You see how that works? But I'm going to show you something here in a minute that'll show you how that works. So anyway, we took the rock, took 3 years. We had to process it. We took it back to the lab. We sent it to 9 labs, the same labs that I used as a secular scientist. Excruciatingly expensive. But it was financed by Christians from around the world. And it took, like I said, several years. So we get the rock. We don't tell them where we found it. We just say, here's the sample. Give us the statistics. We ask them to date it. Out of 9 dates, 8 of them came back from 1 million up to 3.7 million for 12-year-old rock. We got one date that was under 1 million, and it was 390,000. Give or take a few hundred is stretching it, but not a few million. But there's a lot of problems with this type of dating procedure in the first place. What about when the rock was heated and melted and mixed? And see, all of these things are never discussed. That's what I told you. That's why the name of this presentation is what you're not being told. There's a lot of problems with the dating procedures. But the bottom line is none of them can actually date a fossil. We can get ballpark figures and guesses and then take it on faith. I was one of several scientists. I was invited again to go by Dr. Kurt Weiss, who was a paleontologist from Harvard, got his PhD from Stephen Gould, who was my hero. He invited me to go on this dinosaur excavation up in Wyoming, the Hansen Research Project. Well, in the course of our research, and it was excruciating too, we were out there for a month in the middle of a cow pasture, but I found this Pachycephalosaurus skull. Well, automatically, based on the world and my secular thinking, then that is 65 million years old. It's in the Jurassic, it's a dinosaur. My mother said it was a great find. Pachy means thick, and cephala means head. Thick-headed dinosaur for a thick-headed scientist. Well, right over next to this, and I thought I had a picture. I do have a 35 millimeter picture somewhere. I thought I had it, but there was a piece of petrified wood sticking out of the bank, right in the same layer as this. And so, you know what grad students are for. So I gave them some toothbrushes and dental tools, and told them to excavate it. And they started excavating that piece of petrified wood. It was really cool because once they got back into the bank and they cleared it back about 20 inches, it was coalified. So now we've got petrification and we've got coalification on the same piece. That's really cool. Coalification is a way of fossilizing anyway. But the shocker came when we got the whole thing out. The last 28 inches of it was pure wood. It was a soft species of pine found in Canada. And now it's down here on the plains of Wyoming in a 65 million year old. Guys, it doesn't take a rocket science to figure out that blood cells, skin, bone, wood rots. It doesn't lay there for 65 million years unless it fossilizes. Minerals replace the cells, turning it to rock. Well, we were able to date that wood that's in a layer of 65 million year old dinosaur, and it came back in a ballpark figure between 28 and 3,800 years. Do you suppose maybe the dinosaurs were on the ark? Good chance. Here's what that packy looks like when you get the whole thing out. It's a pretty impressive specimen. And one of the reasons that we find more is look at the size of the thing and look how thick it is. It stands up to weathering and is more likely to fossilize. Human bones are so fragile that it's rare for them to fossilize. Here again, you can see in this big rock, you can see that piece of wood. Again, part of that wood, it was petrified completely around, but this center part, in fact, we carried it with us. We used to put it out there on the table, but people kept digging at it, so we put it away. But again, there's a piece of the wood. It's soft, identifiable, datable wood. So you see, it doesn't take necessarily millions of years. It takes the right conditions: heat, water, mineral, and pressure. That's what it takes, not necessarily time. And I showed you this, the Brontosaurus, that we know there's no such thing as a Brontosaurus. Then why don't we get rid of it? Why don't we call it what it really is? I wanted to show you this. So if fossilization takes millions of years, then Neanderthal must have been a lot more advanced than we thought, because that's an English bowler up there. Solid rock. It was found in a mine that was only 40 years old. We have a roll of barbed wire, solid rock. How long do you think barbed wire has been invented? You see how it can happen quickly? These stalagmites and stalactites, I was taught, took millions of years to form, and that was found in a cave that was only 20 years old. But according to the world, the stalagmites, it was millions of years. But here's the one I wanted to read to you. See this opal right here? It says, despite the common teaching that it takes millions of years to form opal, Australian researcher Lynn Cram has long been growing opal in his backyard laboratory. His opal, shown below, is indistinguishable under the electron microscope from that mined in the field. He was awarded an honorary doctorate for his work by a secular university. All he does is mix together the right common chemicals, no heat, no pressure, and definitely no millions of years. Do you see what I mean by what you're not being told? That there are alternatives to this? One of the other things that has occurred is diamonds, supposedly, the hardest substance, and diamonds are pure carbon that have formed over billions of years, deep in the earth. So since carbon dissipates, once the living animal or plant or human dies, you start to lose the carbon. It starts to decay. That's why you can't get million-year dates. You can only, it's totally dissipated within a few hundred years. Usually, you could stretch it to 10,000 or so, but no scientist in the world stretches it to millions. So in that case, then diamonds should have no measurable carbon in them. And the layers of the earth, from the Precambrian, the Cambrian, and right on up through. And by the way, who invented the geologic column? A group of scientists in the 1800s. They invented it to support their Darwinian theory. There's never been a place on this planet or any other that they have found the entire geologic column. They assign the dates based on preconceived ideas. But if each was older, millions of years for the Precambrian, the Cambrian, billions, 4.5 billion all the way up to current, then there should be different layers of carbon, amounts of carbon in each layer, right? Because they were over. We found measurable amounts of carbon exactly the same in every layer that we can reach. There's only one explanation for that it was laid down all at the same time. There's no other explanation. So, you see what you're not being told? Well, no one ever bothered to check diamonds because they were considered to be billions of years old. Well, a group of scientists several years ago called the RATE Project, Radioisotopes in the Age of Earth, started doing it, and they started testing, and they're finding measurable rates of carbon in diamonds from around the world, all the same. That, again, should be impossible if they are millions or billions of years old. But you're not being told. Here's an article on coal. It says coal needs only weeks, not millions of years to form. It has been known for many years that the most important factor for coalification is temperature. The higher the temperature, the higher the degree of coalification or rank of coal. The length of time is not particularly important. Pressure actually retards the chemical reaction slightly. But see, the kids are never told this. You know, do you realize that we're getting hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil out of closed oil wells that were closed 35 and 40 years ago because they ran dry? Where do you suppose the new oil came from? You see, these are the things that you're not being told. How about this billion-year-old fossil? You see, there is an alternative for everything. Now I want to skip this. Let me get this. I want to talk a little bit about the fossils, and then I want to talk about some of the information. But look at this. I was talking about the feathered dinosaurs. This was out of Discover magazine. Look what it says. Archaeoraptor is just the tip of the iceberg. And by the way, I actually got to see this fossil in real from China. God blessed us. This is a long story. I'll tell you if you want to hear it later. But Archaeoraptor is just the tip of the iceberg. There are scores of fake fossils out there, and they have cast a dark shadow over the whole field. When you go to these fossil shows, it's difficult to tell which ones are fake and which ones are not. I have heard there's a fake fossil factory in northeast China in Liaoning province. Well, they haven't heard. They've actually found it. Where many of these recent alleged, you catch that, feathered dinosaurs were found. But see, that's not being told. Fake dinosaur fossils, it's just disgusting. It's like that article I showed you first half, where even though we know it isn't true, we teach it as an established fact. Guys, that is just wrong, and we need to stop doing that. How about this one? I told you about that one. Australopithecus afarensis, Lucy, 3.7 million years old. How? I get kids come and say, well, scientists have carbon dated Lucy, and she's our missing link, and so, guys, that is total nonsense. But what they don't tell you, is rarely mentioned, is that the fact that the knee joint, which was the part that supposedly made her a link to humans, was found over a mile away from the skeleton and 200 feet lower. How do you put those together? It's wishful thinking. But here's the other part. Look at that fossil there on the cover. How much of that is fossil and how much of that is somebody's imagination? Where did that pointy head and those big rounded things, where did that come from? You see, that's what happened when we got the actual fossils. We found out that most of the fossils had been either sanded, carved, filed, or changed to make them fit. That is just wrong. But if that's all you have, that's what you go with. See, that's what I mean about putting all of the evidence out there, and let's let the evidence speak for itself. That's why we don't. It's getting worse. But see, God said it was good. He told us to take care of his creation. But this quote, Genesis 1 right there, and God said, let there be light. Where was God when he created light? See, that caused me a lot of grief because I was trying to deal with the light coming from billions of light years away, and I couldn't figure it. But you know what? Like I told you, I showed you in these astronomy DVDs, you'll see it. These pictures, NASA, it's sending back stuff that's going all different ways that should not be possible if the Big Bang really occurred. But I showed you that the speed of light has slowed down. All of the constants have changed. But one thing that helped me, and again, hypotheses are fine. Opinions, like I said, are perfectly legitimate if we have different ones. But it's not okay to inflict my opinion on you as fact. But one of the things I did with the students as an experiment is I was teaching them the scientific method and how you, again, peer review. So I gave them very expensive architectural measuring devices, and I divided them into teams, and they had to do a log, a journal, and I gave them a big giant white balloon, and they were to put dots on the balloon, to connect the dot picture. And they could make any picture they wanted, but they were to make a dot, measure precisely, put another dot, and then log it. Then after they finished with their balloon, they would give it to their lab partner who would either falsify it or confirm it. Peer review. If everything was correct, then I had them blow up the balloon. What do you think happened to the dots? Then it dawned on me. 17 times in Scripture, God talks about the heavens being like a garment, stretched, rolled like a scroll, torn like a garment, flexible. And then I had this picture when I first accepted Christ in 1987. I pictured God sitting up there on this big throne, And Creation Week, he was going out there, and he was going, zap, let there be, zap, let there, speaking it into existence, up there. Then it dawned on me, where was God? Well, he tells me. He says, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the earth. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. What's the very next words? And God said, let there be light. Where was God when he created light? He was here. And he said, let there be light. And I went that way. So I'm not seeing light coming from millions of light years away. I'm seeing it going that way. Is that a legitimate scientific hypothesis? Yes, it is, absolutely. Can I prove it? No. Can you prove it's coming the other way? No. You see, we need to have an open mind. There are alternatives to everything. And God said what he meant, and he meant what he said. We're going to finish with these next few slides, but I want to do this, and then tomorrow I will get into a little bit of the genome and some of the astronomy. But Dr. Werner Gitt, professor from the German Federal Institute of Physics, in his book, In the Beginning Was Information, he made this statement, and it struck fear in the hearts of the secular scientific community because they cannot argue with this. The reason you haven't heard his name is they will not admit that he's alive. They will not review his book, and even to say it's garbage, because they don't want you to know he exists, because no scientist in the world can argue with that. There is no known law of nature, no known process, no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. Do you catch that? Pretty straightforward, but here's the kicker. Ask yourself this. Where does information come from then, if it doesn't originate by itself in matter? Where did the information in this computer come from? Did I buy this little gray box and sit it on the table and all of a sudden it was full of information? It came from the creator of the computer. Where did the information in the PowerPoint come from that I've shown you today? From the creator of the PowerPoint. Where do you suppose the information in the universe came from? The creator of the universe. Just using common sense. Because no known law, it doesn't originate by itself in matter. Well, let's take a look. Well, what is information? Information, conservapedia. Information is a message transmitted by a message sender and received and understood by a message receiver. Information can be, look at this, considered to be the third fundamental quantity of the universe after matter and energy. Information is a non-material entity which some say only arises from an intelligence. Others, committed to a materialistic view, disagree, yet offer no examples of information arising from non-intelligent sources. They just flat disagree. They have no evidence. But information does not originate by itself in matter. And they all know that. Well, how about this? The code of life. Molecular biologists have been studying, look at this, the genetic code for over a decade. In the Human Genome Project, scientists have identified, look at this, all 30,000 genes in the human DNA and the determined sequences of 3 billion base pairs. Now do you see what happened in the Human Genome Project? How it absolutely overwhelmed them with the complexity. But here's the kicker. Molecular biologists have found that chemical processes in life are controlled by genes in the DNA, and look at this, and the information is encoded on the DNA in every living cell. That's from the world, folks. That's from the secular scientists. If information does not arise by itself in matter, and every single cell in your DNA has information in it, then where did it come from? You see how using common sense and deductive reasoning, you see now why they don't want you to know this? Because there's only one logical explanation. Here are some of the mediums of information. You have acoustic information. It's transmitted by sound. Optical information, transmitted by written words, flags, barcodes, sign languages, tactile information, magnetic, electrical, chemical, olfactory, electrical. All of this information requires something. Intelligence. And information does not arise by itself in matter. You catch my drift yet? This is just common sense. This is just following their evidence, not mine. How about this one? Seth Lloyd, a quantum mechanical engineer at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, proposes a different way to take the measure of the cosmos. Look at this, how much data it generates. Look at this, every physical event in cosmic history represents a piece of information. But information does not originate by itself in matter. But every physical event in cosmic history represents a piece of information. Every single cell in your DNA has information. Where does it come from? Common sense, deductive reasoning, follow the evidence. Where does it lead you? Right, straight to the creator of the DNA. The cosmos contains roughly 10 to the 90th bits of what? Information, according to Seth Lloyd, the Institute of Technology. By factoring in the available energy and speed of light, which we know is not a constant, but the universe could have performed at most 10 to the 120th logical operations. So if we wanted to simulate that as humans, simulate the universe on the computer would have to be as powerful as the universe itself, folks. Crude approximations are all we can do. Because all of the computers that have ever existed on Earth have carried out just 10 to the 31st operations. There is one simple question. Where did all this information come from? It doesn't originate by itself in matter. I can tell you right here. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through Him, and without Him nothing was made that was made. Words are information. In the beginning, God. That's where the information came from. Thanks, guys.